Okay, we're going to start our next session. I'm really happy to introduce our next speaker, Anna Abram. You can read her bio in your program, so I won't go over her entire bio, but what you need to know is she's Deputy Commissioner for Policy, Planning, Legislation, and Analysis. She has a long track record, including service on the HELP Committee with Senator Burr, and a terrific background so many times. And I was telling Anna that we've already been talking about policy over and over again. And so she's a very popular speaker, as you can tell from how packed the room is. She has prepared remarks, and then she'll take some Q&A before lunch. So welcome.
Good morning. Oh, we can do better than that. Good morning. Much better. Thank you, Susan, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to the Galien Forum for inviting me to speak today. It is an honor to be asked to participate in this day-long discussion on what is being done to address some of our nation's greatest and most pressing health challenges. Very clearly, FDA has an important seat at the table as patients, scientists, healthcare providers, payers, and industry grapple with the scientific and policy issues surrounding opiate addiction, drug pricing, clinical trial modernization, and leveraging cutting-edge tools and processes. In fact, all four issues are a high priority for our Commissioner, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who sends his warm regards. 20 years ago, Susan was the chief medical officer at Genentech when FDA approved the company's monoclonal antibody, Herceptin, for the treatment of HER2-positive metastatic breast cancers. On the same day, FDA approved a test to detect HER2 protein overexpression in breast cancer cells. It marked the dawn of a new era of cancer treatment and the beginning of what many hoped would be an exciting trend toward co-development of molecularly targeted therapies with tests that could identify the right therapies for the right patients. FDA responded to this new era by quickly moving to build and shape a regulatory framework that would help usher in the emergence of tailored medical products. Today, the immense amount of discovery and translation going on around the human genome and gene therapy and other areas of medicine are providing new ways to address human disease. But just as FDA was challenged at the dawn of personalized or precision medicine, we are challenged again to continue to modernize our approach to evaluating innovations, or more simply stated, to keep up. This has meant, in many cases, creating new approaches that are better suited to the efficient evaluation of these advances without compromising FDA's science-based standards. Today, I'd like to tell you what steps we're taking to stay ahead amidst so much biomedical innovation by highlighting a few key aspects. In particular, ensuring a world-class workforce collaborating across the agency, and updating some of our regulatory approaches. FDA relies on a world-class scientific staff to evaluate innovative medical products and keep up with ever-changing technologies. And while our world-class facilities are certainly a draw, staffing has been a challenge for FDA, especially in those disciplines where there's already a short supply of experts and stiff competition from the private sector. FDA currently has a workforce of more than 18,000 people, and of those, 10,000 were hired in the past decade. Yet, we're still striving to catch up. Too many of the positions supported by user fees remain vacant, even while our overall attrition rate is about 5% annually. We continue to strive to optimize the most efficient hiring processes. The FDA Reauthorization Act of 2017, or FDARA, which reauthorized our human drug, device, and biologics medical product user fee programs, included an FDA commitment to complete the modernization of the hiring infrastructure and other enhancements. Dr. Gottlieb's first step in meeting these commitments was to order a comprehensive baseline assessment of our hiring processes. The report was issued about a year ago. It found that only 31% of hiring managers in our drugs and biologics centers were satisfied with the quality of their new hires, and there were vacancy rates of about 14% in both our Center for Biologics and Center for Drugs, about double what is common for other government agencies. And the end-to-end hiring process took from 150 to 550 days. We have several initiatives underway to address these challenges. We launched a hiring pilot to test a totally redesigned end-to-end hiring process that has already shown results in reducing the total time to hire by 50% and is setting a new gold standard for FDA hiring practices. Second, we hired an associate director for our scientific staffing team who has a background in both regulatory science and recruitment and outreach. The team represents the agency at scientific conferences and is forging strategic relationships with academic institutions and professional associations to bring in promising young scientists. We also stood up a hiring team focused on physician hiring. It has already reduced the time to hire physicians by 80%. And we are taking steps to showcase as an employer of choice, FDA, as an employer of choice for workers in the Washington area. The new pay authority under the 21st Century Cures Act, which allows FDA to bring on top candidates at competitive salaries, is also helping. Of the Cures hires we have made to date, 50% of the new hires stated that they would not have been able to come to the FDA for lower pay, an excellent metric for the new hiring and pay authority. Another way we're laying groundwork for success is to rethink how we are organized. No one person and no one office could possibly stay abreast of today's biomedical advances or address the complexity of today's many health challenges. Creating environments that enhance collaboration, teamwork, and knowledge sharing are keys to success. FDA has a history of fruitful collaboration with a wide variety of medical and scientific organizations, including those in biomedical research, the drug, biologics, and medical device industries, academia, global organizations, as well as patients and their advocacy groups. We also collaborate internally with cross-agency groups, such as our Senior Science Council, our Nanotechnology Task Force, and our Emerging Science Work Group, the latter of which is tasked with horizon scanning for new technology. Now, we're breaking down silos on a more operational basis. We're changing how we organize ourselves as part of the medical product review process and moving away from a structure that had people working in discrete organizational units that often operated as independent entities, rather than an integrated team that functioned together to share best practices and knowledge. Instead, we're evolving toward a more team-based approach that integrates people from different disciplines and across different states of a product's life cycle. Our efforts began over a year ago when FDA launched its Oncology Center of Excellence, or OCE, to leverage the combined skills of regulatory scientists and reviewers with expertise in drugs, biologics, and devices, including diagnostics. Authorized by the 21st Century Cures Act, OCE is FDA's first intercenter institute that focuses on a specific disease area rather than a type of product. And its interdisciplinary work is already yielding significant advances. Last May, FDA approved for adult and pediatric patients the first cancer treatment based on a tumor's biomarker rather than the tumor site or cell type. Testing was permitted using a single therapeutic approach for patients with different tumor types rather than requiring separate development programs for each disease site. The lessons we have learned from creating and operationalizing OCE will be applied elsewhere within FDA. Our goal is to be more disease-focused and more integrated across the disciplines involved in drug review and better able to evaluate and analyze data. Our Center for Drug Evaluation and Research is currently planning to reorganize its Office of New Drugs in this way. And organizational changes are also afoot at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, where we're combining the Office of Compliance, Office of Device Evaluation, Office of Surveillance and Biometrics, and Office of In Vitro Diagnostics and Radiological Health into a new Office of Product Evaluation and Quality. OPEQ will be a Total Product Lifecycle Office. Total Product Lifecycle reflects a holistic approach that takes into account all the information and programs CDRH is responsible for, which impact the design, production, and use of medical devices and electronic products. The new configuration will eventually comprise 7 different offices of health technology, which will be responsible for pre-market review, post-market surveillance, and manufacturing quality and compliance to ensure patients have access to safe, effective, and high-quality technology. There will also be offices dedicated to the medical device clinical evidence programs and another dedicated to the medical device regulatory programs implemented within CDRH. Finally, there's another important way in which we're poised for success by being flexible, transparent, and creative in our regulatory approaches while upholding FDA's gold standards. This means taking advantage of innovative approaches that are better suited to the efficient evaluation of new technology, but do so without compromising FDA's science-based and regulatory standards. A prime example is our approach to cell-based regenerative medicine. Last November, FDA released a comprehensive policy framework for the oversight of regenerative medicine products that include cell therapies, therapeutic tissue engineering products, human cell and tissue products, and combination products using any such therapies or products, as well as gene therapies that lead to durable modification of cells or tissues, including genetically modified cells. The framework includes 2 final and 2 draft guidance documents that, among other things, more clearly describe the distinction between products that require pre-market authorization and those that do not. We've recently followed that up by issuing a complementary policy framework for the development, review, and approval of gene therapies. The suite of 6 scientific guidance documents we issued in July are intended to serve as building blocks of a modern, comprehensive framework for this new field. Dr. Peter Marks, director of our Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, will have more to say when he speaks to you later on today. Flexibility also marks our approach to the regulatory framework where we've adopted for genomic and genetic testing using next-generation sequencing. We issued final guidance in April that explains how test developers may rely on clinical evidence from FDA-recognized public databases to support clinical claims while providing assurance of the accurate clinical evaluation of the test results. A second guidance provided recommendations on the design, development, and analytical validation of these tests. To the extent that FDA can ensure that our regulatory requirements are streamlined, predictable, and science-based, we can reduce the time, uncertainty, and cost of medical product development. And that includes the development for branded drugs as well as generic and biosimilar alternatives. The high price of prescription drugs has certainly been one of the most controversial issues confronting the biopharmaceutical industry in recent years. Drug pricing is a major concern for the public and for the administration. The fact is, new medical innovations will not benefit patients and consumers if people cannot afford to access these innovations. To further encourage drug competition and help bring greater efficiency and transparency to the generic drug approval process, we launched the Drug Competition Action Plan last year. This includes further streamlining the generic review process to increase efficiency and effectiveness with the ultimate goal of more approvals, reducing the so-called gaming that frustrates and delays generic drug approvals and extends brand monopolies beyond what Congress intended in the Hatch-Waxman Amendments of 1984, and supporting the development and enhanced review of complex generic drug products to make it easier for companies to bring generic competition to this important category of branded drugs. Being able to genericize a complex drug can be a high-value opportunity for a generic drug developer. These higher-value generic business opportunities can help underwrite the costs of other generic applications at a time when we believe the generic industry is facing new economic pressures from rising costs, supply chain consolidation, increased competition, and declining reimbursement on many generic medicines. Moreover, because brand name versions of complex drug products are often higher priced than many other brand name drugs, any steps we can take to encourage the development of generic competitors for complex drugs may have an outsized impact on access and drug spending. Achieving a competitive marketplace for therapeutic biological products is equally crucial, and in fact is becoming more important every day. Biologics are used to treat many serious illnesses, including rare genetic disorders, autoimmune disease, and cancer, and they often offer the only effective or available treatment option. They currently account for about a third of new drugs approved by the FDA, but represent almost 40% of all prescription drug spending and account for 70% of the growth in drug spending from 2010 to 2015, according to a RAND study. The FDA has approved 12 biosimilars, including 2 biosimilars for cancer, including a biosimilar to Herceptin, and interest remains high in these products, but with nearly 60 development programs enrolled in FDA's Biosimilar Biological Product Development Program. While that's good news, so far, only a fraction of the biosimilars approved have gone to market, in part due to the dynamics in the marketplace. To accelerate biosimilar competition, Dr. Gottlieb launched a 4-part biosimilars action plan in July to enhance regulatory predictability and encourage market understanding. It focuses on achieving greater review efficiencies, providing more regulatory clarity through guidance, reducing gaming intended to unfairly delay market competition, and developing educational materials that will address knowledge gaps about these products. To further reduce the cost of drug development and potentially lower drug costs, FDA is working across our medical product centers to make clinical trials more efficient by facilitating innovative trial designs and patient-centered endpoints. For example, we're encouraging the use of master clinical trial protocols, such as basket, umbrella, and platform trials, which involve a common clinical trial infrastructure to study one or more interventions in multiple diseases or a single disease with multiple interventions, each targeting a biomarker-defined population or disease subtype. Seamless trial designs are being used in oncology that compress the traditional trial phases into one large, continuous trial. Such approaches may be able to reduce the number of patients needed for clinical development and the time it takes to complete necessary studies, thus reducing costs while also enabling investigators to learn more about a product's efficacy and safety and help regulators and sponsors detect efficacy and safety signals earlier in the development process. FDA is also exploring the development of predictive models based on natural history data, which may be able to obviate the need for placebo arms in some clinical trials for rare diseases by allowing researchers to estimate what a subject's outcome would have been if they had not received an investigational therapy. And we're encouraging more widespread use of modeling and simulation in both new and generic drug product development that can be used to organize diverse data sets, explore alternate trial designs, strategies, and predict performance. Clinical trials are often conducted in specialized and controlled research settings and can still leave critical questions unanswered, particularly about the effects of a medical product after it is used by a broader population over an extended period of time. Over the past decade, FDA has begun to harness real-world data to help us answer some of these questions. Our work with the Sentinel system was initially focused on post-market surveillance, but FDA is actively evaluating the potential uses of real-world evidence to support pre-market regulatory decisions. And FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health recently issued guidance that provides recommendations that will enable clinical investigators to understand how FDA will evaluate data collected from routine medical care and how FDA will determine whether the collected evidence is appropriate to support regulatory decision-making. Finally, a word on opiate addiction, since you'll be discussing that topic here today. The FDA has taken significant steps across the life cycle of these drugs to reduce the risk of opiate addiction and death, including requiring generic and branded sponsors of extended release and long-acting opioids to make education available to prescribers. And for the first time, this requirement is being expanded to include immediate release formulations as well. We're also using our existing drug safety surveillance resources to explore how we can create benchmarks for more rational opioid prescribing through product labeling or REMS. Together with the application of modern tools, we believe it's possible to work with prescribers to create rational opioid prescribing standards for acute pain that can lower the risk of opiate addiction and drug diversion, while keeping these powerful medicines available for patients with severe pain, such as from a metastatic cancer. We're also doing what we can to encourage the development of opioids that are harder to manipulate and abuse. While not abuse-proof, these formulations can make certain types of abuse, such as crushing a tablet to snort or dissolving a capsule to inject, more difficult or less rewarding. Several abuse-deterrent products have been approved, but they are only available as more expensive brand name products, many of which are not covered by payers. Last year, we issued a final guidance to assist industry in the development of generic versions of approved abuse-deterrent formulations. In July, we posted 3 revised product-specific guidances. The drug Naloxone is potentially life-saving treatment that can reverse the effects of an opioid overdose, usually within minutes if quickly administered. Although naloxone is a critical tool that individuals, families, first responders, and communities can use to help reduce opioid overdose deaths, there's still a need to improve access to this drug. Early this week, FDA announced an upcoming advisory committee meeting to solicit input and advice on strategies to increase the availability of naloxone products. One of the issues to be discussed at the 2-day meeting in December is whether naloxone should be co-prescribed with all or some opioid prescriptions to help reduce the risk of an overdose. As you will hear at today's conference, there are any number of novel approaches under development to treat diseases, from cancer therapies to the human microbiome, as well as novel policy approaches to our most challenging public health problems like opiate addiction. This is truly an exciting time in science and medicine, with increasing insights and advances that hold tremendous potential and promise to improve the health and well-being for so many. FDA must be as modern as the cutting-edge innovations we are responsible for regulating, ensuring our frameworks and processes are streamlined, predictable, and science-based. We are actively taking steps to advance modern and efficient regulatory frameworks built on strong infrastructure, staffing collaborations, and cutting-edge science. Thank you.
Oh. Take questions over here, and we'll let you sit.
Oh, I'll just leave this here then.
Working? Can you hear me? Now, yes, thank you. So I'll take the prerogative for the first question, but start getting your questions ready. As you mentioned, 20 years ago, I was at FDA happily seeing the approval of Herceptin and Hercept test. And to my shock and dismay, it turned out that pathologists didn't want us to have 1+, 2+, 3+ ELISA readout. They wanted us to say yes Herceptin, no Herceptin. And that opened my eyes to what had been a very academic, very inside baseball way of thinking about the companion diagnostic for precision medicine. We heard earlier today that even now, most community oncologists, and I would submit community pathologists, don't know how to use the new medicines or the tests for those. You mentioned that FDA approved the first precision therapy for pediatrics driven completely by the test. How do you think about the community oncologists, the community pathologists, and making sure that the approval means that people in their communities can actually safely and effectively use those new remedies?
So, great question. There's a lot behind that. I think one of the key aspects is we really encourage developers to come in early and consult with the agency. But I think that there's also, increasing opportunities to have cross-cutting dialogue with all of those who are impacted with these promising innovations, because as you point out in your example, when you bring forward an innovation but the clinical community maybe struggles to adopt it or has a knowledge curve in its application, then that is delaying or perhaps preventing the full potential clinical benefit to the patients for whom it's intended to be used for. And so I think that inherent in your question underscores really the importance of a lot of the cross-cutting dialogue that's happening amongst industry, amongst academic researchers, so that their input is being built in and thought of across the continuum of development. I think personally, one of the most exciting aspects of the current paradigm that we're in is how patient-focused it is. I mean, it's always been about patients. That's why we all do this. That's patients and consumers are the core of FDA's mission. But there really has been a noticeable change in recent years, codified through recent PDUFA agreements on the patient-focused drug development and also patient-reported outcomes. And I think with that, we'll also bring along the clinical community, because when you think about when you're treating a patient, so much of it is between the patient and their physician. I should also mention, I usually mention this before I turn to Q&A when I have the opportunity to be out and about, that I think it's important to also hear from you, from those who are impacted and really on the front lines where our policies are being implemented. So even if you don't have a question, but you're burning to provide feedback that I can bring back to the agency, please don't be please don't be shy. So.
There's a question right here.
And if you could just identify who you are before you ask the question, that's always helpful.
Hi, I'm in Salem. I'm a neurosurgeon out of LA, and I'm the CEO of IQ Technologies, Inc., which is a software company that does AI and blockchain and digital health. And my question is regarding standalone AI algorithms. You have companies like Apple and Fitbit that they have their own standalone AI algorithms, and they're not medical grade yet. What is the FDA position for allowing these to be standalone outside the clinical supervision of doctors and the healthcare community?
Yeah, so I'll answer that a little indirectly. I think that this has been an iterative process in working through the technology. And when you look at the innovation cycles on the drug and biologic side of the house, and you look at it on the device side of the house and technologies, they're very different in the sense that there is a certain rapid pace to the integration. And some of that's inherent even within the pathways that are established for bringing forward devices for clearance or approval. So some of that's inherent to it. And so I think that this has been an iterative process that the agency has been working on. I wouldn't say that necessarily our policy is completely set in stone. In part, I know that the Center for Devices and Radiological Health has been looking at these issues in terms of making sure that they're getting the information that they need, and then also having dialogue with this community, working with those types of products to figure out really how to put in place a risk-based paradigm. That's something that is a consistent approach across the work that the FDA does. We try to be risk-based in all that we do, because inherent in that is you want the agency looking at what are going to be the riskiest considerations for patients in terms of kind of where the greatest focus is. And so oftentimes you'll see a more tiered approach, a risk-based approach to the considerations of those projects. But it is a challenge for the agency in terms of the rapid innovation that we're seeing, and how do you make sure that you have a framework that is consistent, science-based, in protecting and promoting the public health, while also enabling and being able to see promising technologies and innovations that will benefit patients and their outcomes coming forward. And so it's something that we continue to work on in terms of setting and calibrating that accordingly.
I've one question, but that's just in terms of what was just asked.
Yep.
When Rob Califf was the commissioner, a similar question was asked of him, and he said we're preparing at the FDA for a tsunami of these, recreational type devices that are forthcoming. So I just was wondering, has the tsunami begun to develop, or was that sort of? Well, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Finish up.
So the real question is this. This is naive and outside of the FDA legislation, but does the FDA, does it do, or is it ever contemplated trying to direct pharma biotech device interests in specific public health needs that are not being adequately addressed? I'm Jeffrey Lieberman, Chair of Psychiatry at Columbia, and there's been a massive kind of retreat from psychotropic drug development for good scientific reasons, but nevertheless leaving this major public health need sort of relatively less emphasized. So I know with AIDS and when there's certain kinds of acute epidemic public health crises, there's sort of exceptional efforts that are made. Is anything done along these lines for what I'm referring to?
Yeah. First, I'll answer your question on the tsunami question that you asked at the outset and say it's really best directed to Dr. Jeff Schern, who heads up CDRH, so he would really be on the receiving end of that. But yes, we can continue to see innovation kind of across the breadth of the work there, so I'll answer that more generally. In terms of your question about what the agency is doing and how we're engaging and collaborating in some of the unmet medical need areas, which of course is such a cornerstone of a consideration for much of what the agency does. When you have an unmet medical need and you're considering a product, that will be factored into kind of the approach that's taken with the review and oftentimes the time that it takes. And you're absolutely correct when you point out that there are times when there's a public health urgency where it necessitates government partners, industry partners, other stakeholders coming together to have dialogue around what is the best path forward as part of a response to that emergent situation. But in addition to that, there's a lot of standing ongoing work that happens across the medical product centers on a regular basis, opportunities for dialogue and collaboration, hearing from areas of the practice of medicine where in particular there may be a concern. I'll come back to my remarks earlier around the shift towards a patient-focused paradigm. I think inherent in that, and I know a lot of my colleagues at the agency spend time getting out, meeting with patients, participating in forums where they have the opportunity to hear from patients and their clinicians, as well as in AdCom situations, because AdComs are not just for when a product-specific matter is being brought forward. Sometimes they will come together to look at the current state of development or care in a certain area. And so it's something that we try to do across the breadth of all the areas that we're responsible for. In the patient-focused drug development context, I can tell you that there is just a surge of interest across all patient areas, across all disease areas. And I think at the last count we had 20 or so of those, but you can imagine that the ones that we haven't held yet, there's still high interest in continuing to move that forward. But I will absolutely bring back that feedback that was also built into your question.
Just one quick comment. So, and I'm not being critical, I understand your development of the FDA. So take addiction.
Yep.
There's no virtual
Yeah.
Vivitrol.
So I want to give somebody else a chance to
Yeah.
answer a question. I don't mean to cut you off, but just two quick comments. I think the convening power of FDA,
Yeah.
as you were talking about, is really important. Priority vouchers and speed to approval have been two immensely important tactics and tools that FDA has to drive innovation in areas. These are rewards that people respond to.
Yeah. So sorry if that was a little opaque in my reference to unmet medical need being such a critical criteria, because that can help to factor in and determine the time that a product is given review, more of the all hands on deck approach, breakthrough therapy designation, priority review, fast track, accelerated
These are the
approval. There's a lot of different pathways that could, sorry, I took it for granted this audience knew that. But yes, it's factored in.
There's a question here.
Hi, I'm Joel Roslin, Columbia University. I teach a course on ethics and research as well as ethics in the pharmaceutical.
The microphone's right behind you.
Yep.
Thank you. There are specific cases where FDA approval was contingent upon education for clinicians as well as for patients, and I'm wondering whether there's opportunity for greater educational requirement around either initial acceptance of a drug or when problems develop, such as with opioid abuse, and whether more can be done by the FDA to mandate education for both prescribers as well as for patients.
Yeah, I think you're referencing some of the considerations that the agency has looked at in the context of its risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, REMS authorities, and that is something that we have been looking at particularly in the space of opioids. And I mentioned in my remarks how for the first time we have been extending requirements not just to the immediate formulations, not just a longer acting. And so it's something that we are scanning and has been part of the dialogue that we've been looking at internally in the midst of the opiates legislation that was actually just signed into law yesterday in terms of, how we are adjusting based on when you see the longer term effects and public health considerations. I mean, the agency moved to take an opiate off the market last year, in part because we looked at the totality of the public health evidence, and it necessitated the agency to take further action. And so that is something that we continue to look at. I think inherent in it is also the unique considerations with respect to a product, right? Not every product may necessarily have the same need for education per se, but particularly in the context of some of the REMS, it is a consideration.
Yes, there's a question in the front row. Hi.
My question is for you, Dr. Desmond-Hellmann. I was Peace Corps Guatemala and then launched the Duke Global Health Institute, and we talked a lot about compulsory licensing and TRIPS for other countries and, breaking patents and using our intellectual property to produce generic drugs and use them in third world countries. And I was just curious what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, so I know I'll speak for my colleagues at the Gates Foundation that we're really positive about patent protection. We're really positive about private industry. And you'll hear us talking about concepts of market failure. We have a lot of different tools we use to solve market failures, but we want innovators to want to innovate and want to pursue being a successful company. So we think there's a lot of different things from volume guarantees, tiered pricing. We also think there's growing markets in these areas. India is one in particular, in sub-Saharan Africa, depending on where you go. And so the need for people to have affordable medicines, we buy into, but we think that it needs to be a partnership and a collaboration to drive solutions to market failures, and breaking patents wouldn't be among the tools that we use.
Thank you.
So one very last question.
Hi, I'm Jen. I'm a senior editor at Scientific American, and we had a package out this year, we have it every year, called The Future of Medicine. And instead of doing something that was very innovation-based or personalized medicine-based, we looked at emerging diseases and climate change, both globally and in the US. And I'm wondering and I know this might seem like a question more for like the CDC, but with so much of the focus on, on individualized medicine, personalized medicine, and technology and machine learning and all of these things, where does the FDA stand in terms of looking at the near future of how disease emergence is changing and spreading, and how prepared or unprepared we are for that?
So I think, and actually, when Dr. Marks is on the panel later today, because when you think about his portfolio with the biologics and the vaccines, we have interagency dialogue around medical and public health preparedness and response, because I think inherent in your question is, the challenge that Mother Nature can throw us some pretty significant curveballs, and that can fuel novel, emerging public health threats. And so, in terms of FDA's role in that, is we are in ongoing dialogue with other collaborators. You mentioned CDC, but certainly NIH, Dr. Fauci at NIAID, for emerging infectious diseases. And so that's something where there's, for a long-standing time, kind of always has been a lot of interagency discussion around how can we make sure we are as prepared as possible for not just the public health threats that we have identified, but also getting a curveball, quite frankly, like we've seen. I mean, Mother Nature can be pretty darn creative, and so it's important that we have a framework that can be nimble and responsive, because sometimes you don't get a lot of time to respond to these. And so that's one of the reasons why some of the innovative work that we're doing, we're looking at issues like continuous manufacturing, because that can create a much more nimble footprint to have to pivot and suddenly manufacture another product that might be what's needed at that time to respond to a new emerging threat. Thank you for that question.
So please join me in thanking Anna.
Thank you. I hope that was helpful.